Hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming along. My name's Jan Hogan. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the head of the art discipline. Today we are meeting on Lutruwita, Tasmania, Aboriginal land, sea and waterways. I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this land, the Muwinina people, where we meet today. The exhibition, Experimenta Lifeforms, which is on at the Plimsoll Gallery at the moment, responds to prompts from First Nations ways of knowing and being in the world. The Muwinina people cared and protected country for thousands of years. They knew this land, they lived on the land, and they died on these lands. I honour them. For the Muwinina people, the area around Nipaluna, Hobart, was their country, and they called Mount Wellington Kunanyi. As we walk in the footsteps of those before us, it is important to continue thinking through what life is and through our relationships to the multiple lives around us. The Palawa community now continue the caring for country, and they are renewing and rejuvenating traditional knowledges and skills where art, science and seasonal practices and activities are interwoven. In this spirit, the topics that are being pursued through the Travelling Triennial Experimenta exhibition now showing include the link between art, technology, science and society, the representation and transformation of intelligence, whether or not an artwork leads to new modes of consciousness, and the role of the artist to change our understanding of the world. It is this last one we are considering today. We're focusing on how to develop a sustainable practice as artists and researchers. We have two speakers, Dr. Betty Sargent, visiting as part of Experimenta, and our very own Dr. Niklavs Rubenis from the Art and Design discipline at CAM. We will then open up for discussions. So to begin with, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Betty Sargent, a multi-award-winning, internationally recognised media artist. She is co-creative director and artist with the art technology duo PluginHUMAN. Betty creates multi-sensory installations with a focus on disappearing the interface. The duo create projection mapping, LED and video artworks, and sculptural, immersive, multi-sensory environments. They use the medium of light to translate complex data into meaningful audience experiences. Our focus is on how to imagine new technologies to produce artistic innovations, creating meaningful large and small-scale audience experiences for indoor spaces and outdoor public arenas. PluginHUMAN has created commissioned artworks for institutions such as the National Taiwan Museum of Fine Arts, the Asia Culture Centre in South Korea, and the Melbourne Museum, White Night Festival Australia. So they've exhibited in Europe, North America, Asia and Australia. And they're awarded the Rupert Bunny Foundation Visual Art Fellowship. And they're developing new carbon neutral and carbon negative materials and working methods. They've also won Good Design Awards and a Victorian Premier's Design Award. So it's with great pleasure that we invite Dr. Betty Sargent to speak. Thank you.
Thanks for that lovely introduction. Hello everybody. Thank you for having me here and welcome. I'm a Melbourne-based artist and I work in a duo called PluginHUMAN, and together, we make light installations, mainly with kind of LEDs and projection mapping. And if you don't know what that means, that's fine, because I'm going to show you which is the best way of really understanding what art is being able to see it. So we made, I'll go through some of the work that we've done building up to our current work, just to give it some context. We made this artwork, Dream 2.2, commissioned from the Fine Art Museum in Taiwan, and it was a multi-sensory environment, so it had audio, it had visuals, it had aromas, and it had this explorable maze, so people could walk around inside this maze in the exhibition space. And all of the visuals and the audio were controlled by brainwaves in real time. So what real time means, it's happening in the moment. So it doesn't, you don't have to wait for 5 minutes or for something to be rendered, or it's operating in a flow of information. So audience members could put on a headset, which is what we saw before, this little headband, and that reads, it's called an EEG headset, and that reads the electrical activity that's happening inside the brain. And I suppose we were kind of really interested in how we could further engage audiences in art experiences and how we could physically and socially engage them. And so we did this series of work looking at brain-computer interface, which is the kind of technology that's behind this. All that means is that your brain is able to speak to a computer interface. And so we designed one of those and had a series of performances in the exhibition space, and audiences, then it was open for the audience, and audiences could put on the headset themselves and control the audio and visuals using their neural function. In the performances, we had these 2 sleeping teenagers, and the idea behind that was like, it felt like this kind of taboo world is to have the sleeping teenagers and kind of walk in a poetic sense inside their dreams. So we wondered how far we could stretch this. Like, everybody's got their phone and they're kind of attached to this social and reality media. And we thought, how far can we push it? People are foregoing their own experiences to live through the experiences of others, you know, on social media. And we thought, can we actually ask them to stay up all night and watch someone else sleep, like forego their own sleep to watch somebody else sleep? Because we thought that was completely ridiculous and kind of funny. And fortunately, so did the National Taiwan Museum of Fine Art, because they, you know, some places in Australia were like, do we understand that you want to have sleeping teenagers and you're reading their brainwaves? And they were just thinking that was far too risky and a not okay thing to do. And if anybody has ever had anything to do with teenagers, you wouldn't coerce them to do this in a mad fit. They have to volunteer for this kind of thing. We paid them. It was a professional job. They needed training. So, yeah, that was brain-computer interface. So we make, immersive projection mapping artworks, and started to think, look, why are we focusing on the human? Because, I don't know, humans are so good at impact. Like, we're just specialists at it, I think. And we go, and to think that they can go into a gallery and expect to have impact there as well, to wave their arms around and something will happen because you're so important to the art. Don't get me wrong, I've made art like that, so I'm not dissing it. I'm just saying these are my choices. And I just thought, is that the kind of world I want to live in? Because as an artist, I feel like I'm in the job of like future culture making, that I should be looking at what's the world I want to live in and how do I activate that world and how do I bring people along, hold them by the hand and go, it's okay, I think this is a good place to go. And so we thought, I started making these environmental works where the environment was the interacting factor within the work, really helping audiences to understand that it's okay to let go of that sense of control, and that it's okay to step back and make space for the environment to speak, because that's where we felt we'd arrived as human beings. We felt we'd arrived in a place where the environment needed to be augmented more. So we made these series of works where we used microscopes and all sorts of other equipment to have a look at hidden qualities within our natural environment and to augment those. And we use generative computer processing, which means we write computer code that enables data that comes into the computer, and that data might be, let's just say, temperature, for example. A very simple example, and temperature might change from 12 degrees to 11 degrees to 10 degrees. So that 12, 11, 10 is, in our terms, data. It's a bunch of numbers. Doesn't matter what the numbers are, they can go into a computer and they can control what the animation does. And you can also provide the computer with a sense of control in and amongst itself, allow the computer to start making decisions, and that's when it starts to get generative. And we have touched on making, not really, your machine learning, some types of machine learning work, and our work is going more into machine learning at the moment. So these first series of environmental artworks were really around data. So these bunch of numbers that we collected from the environment. And these numbers may have to do with the conditions of the soil, what's happening with air pollution. On the outside of these, we put leaves and other matter under microscope and then printed them, large format printing. In the centre of these are LED lights, and the LED lights, the colours and the intensity of those lights is again controlled by data from specific ecosystems. So as I mentioned, we use quite a lot of microscopes in our ecological work, and I started to think about a few problematic things, I guess, with our practice. So the more we kind of went away from this, focusing on humans and looking at natural environments, it led me to the materials that I was using and to create the artworks. We'd always been quite environmentally focused in a way, but we use recycled materials, we repurpose our hardware, and we'd been more focused than I suppose most on what the full life span of the equipment and materials that we were using. But we wanted to kind of dig more into this. And I was in the Amazon and in the jungles of Panama doing a creative project there, and I started to make different types of light installations that were driven by, I took nothing in there with, well, actually that's not true. I took microscopes and a whole lot of gear for another artwork I was making. But for making this series, I didn't bring anything with me. I wanted to just respond to what was around me. And so made these small light installations, repurposing lights that were available to me at the time. And then we began a fellowship. And this was 2019, and we'd kind of got this list of, problematic things. Travel being a huge one, is that our work was mostly overseas, and we were expected to be there for the openings and often run workshops. And so, my footprint was appalling because of the travel, and I had to do a lot of offsetting to compensate for that. And going into what sort of became 2020, it was this really sort of fascinating time, particularly as I'm from Melbourne and we were in the biggest lockdown in the world. And so it was a really completely different environment to be creating work in, something that I don't think anybody had experienced before in their lives. And definitely not all good, but some aspects of it can be gleaned as being really positive. And it was fascinating doing this project over that time, and it did have an impact on it. So because I had no access to studios, because we were at home, I had to set up this kitchen in my backyard, and this is a biopolymer kitchen. So we went into this fellowship thinking, well, if we can replace the plastics and the metals that we use with biopolymers, that's going to really account for quite a bit. But if we can get these biopolymers to be compostable, so we can compost them, and high in carbon, so that we actually collect carbon that would have been released into the environment, store it in the biopolymers and compost them, what would that do? What outcome would that have? That was the kind of curiosity we had going into this. So it started off looking at different ways that we could put together organic materials with these biopolymers. And you can see here, this long tube here is a really large sort of biopolymer tube that I've made. And if you can imagine the sculptures that we had before, the big tubes. So this is looking at how do we replace those kind of plastic, recycled plastic materials with something that's compostable. And then here you can see me pouring this biopolymer onto a whole lot of leaves, because there are these plane trees where I live in Melbourne that are like really loved and loathed by people because they're introduced species, they're kind of a hay fever nightmare or an allergy nightmare. They're old historic trees in inverted commas because people think they've been there for a long time. So there's all these contrasting opinions about these trees, but the one thing that is factual is that they drop a ton of leaves, and the council can't keep up. They compost very slowly, so people don't put them in their compost system because they just clog up the compost. They end up in landfill and they create methane, and methane is a gas that's far worse than CO2. So locked up at home for the first time in ages, not travelling, and just looking at what was there, I just went, there are all these leaves. So we collected thousands and thousands of these leaves. And the thing that I learnt when I was in the Amazon that really surprised me actually is that there wasn't a really reliable way of telling how much carbon is stored in a leaf. I thought, it's not my speciality, I'll say that for a beginning. I'm an artist, right? But I did think going to the Amazon, collaborating with scientists from the National Institute of Amazonian Research, that they would have an understanding of what was happening in terms of the Amazon breathing, how much carbon was coming in, how much carbon was going out. I was really underwhelmed at what that, and I'm not saying it's anybody's fault, except maybe a lack of money and resources being put into this area. It just surprised me. So one of the things that's quite complex and can be a little unreliable is how much carbon is stored in a leaf. I thought this would be something that would have been solved by scientists quite a long time ago. And there are different, don't get me wrong, there's a couple of different methods, and some of them are super expensive, so people like us couldn't afford them, and many kind of research budgets wouldn't be able to afford those. And they're also not, when you dig down into it, that reliable. So as we were making these biopolymers and testing different methods for how we could put these biopolymers together, we were starting to think about how can we measure what carbon, the amount of carbon is stored in these. How can we make that measurable about what our impact might have been? I'm just pausing here because not all our experiments run well, but I actually really love this biopolymer. Mould is a real issue with biopolymers, and so that was one of the hurdles that we had to overcome. But this is one of my favourite biopolymer samples, though, I must say. I quite like the mould in that. And so we ended up using a lot of repurposed material that was going to be sent to landfill that could be composted, and this was on the back of another artist's research project that had been running, that had completed just before ours, around how much fabrics could compost and what types of fabrics would compost well and not. So we kind of piggybacked on the back of that and extended from their work, which was terrific, and made these large high carbon biopolymer tubes. And in doing this, there's a very niche area, I'll grant you that. We made a leaf area calculator. So what that means is that anybody who's in looking for the carbon, how much carbon is stored in a leaf is going to go, oh, Betty, but how much does it cost? And I'm going to say it's free. So this was probably one of the incredibly niche, but one of the kind of big outcomes that we did have. And basically we work in a software suite called Touch Designer, which is absolutely fantastic if you're projection mapping and doing real-time artworks. Works really well with Ableton Live if you're doing music as well, just by the by. So we used Touch Designer and programmed within Touch Designer a very simple system where you can use a webcam from your computer and you hold up a leaf and it will instantly calculate the area of that leaf, and then you can multiply that by the number of leaves that you have. And we kind of roughly grouped the leaves into small, medium and large, and so we could get, and that is a lot more accurate than what was currently there. I still don't think it's as accurate, and it's still disappointing to me that that's where we're at in terms of understanding how much carbon is stored in a leaf. I should say, and then you do a calculation based on the carbon that is stored in different tree leaves, and there's a study being done on that. So if anybody wants free access to any of those materials, I have them and happy to share. So we made these biopolymer high carbon light sculptures, and in doing this, did these small experiments as well, where we looked at different ways of introducing colour that was still compostable. And, you know, I mean, you can use inks and paints, and sure, they're compostable, but they're not really great for the system. So for the compost system. So we used a lot of organic materials to use as dyes, and came up with small samples and made a series of small artefacts that were just, I don't know, aesthetically appealing ways of presenting small bits of biopolymer that we'd made. So this was really the back end of the research part of the project. And I'm running a workshop tomorrow, and if any of you, hands up if anyone's coming to the workshop tomorrow. Oh yeah, so these are the kinds of things that we'll make tomorrow in the workshop. And then I looked at, a different way of making light sculptures that were all compostable. And then we came up with a carbon calculator. And it's just an Excel spreadsheet that has, and it's just the beginning of something that we will continue to do throughout our whole practice, and we're happy to share it with anybody who wants to calculate the carbon footprint of their project. It's specifically done for artists and creatives because it's got the kind of materials you might want to work with. We made biopolymers that were really dense in leaves and that were really dense with leaves, I should say, and that were really solid. And we made them in tubes and in square poles, if that's what you call it, like small, you know. And they're incredibly strong, and we can start to use them instead of, say, aluminium and metals and they're compostable as well. And the thing is, it takes a really long time for these to break down. They do compost, and there's nothing in them that's harmful, you know, but we wanted to slow down the time that it would take for it to break down, because the thing with carbon is you want to store it for as long as you can. What we need to do, continuing on for this, is figure out if we bury these, you know, are they going to heat up and create methane and become another problem, or is that another way of doing this? So we've got questions coming out of this research project, but it's certainly, this was a carbon negative project, and we didn't know. It was kind of fascinating. We did this kind of 1.5-year project, massive amounts of calculations on it, and you don't know really until the last day when we're getting all these different figures in, and we just went, we didn't know whether we were going to be have a carbon footprint, have a neutral footprint, have a negative footprint. We were hoping it would be negative, but we didn't know until the final day, and it was like dun dun dun, and then, you know, the calculations kind of came out, and we had in comparison to a non-transport heavy, so a project where we didn't travel a lot, which is the same as this kind of project. We didn't travel a lot because we were locked up. In comparison to another project that we did with that, we were negative 300 kilograms of carbon, and the project prior was positive 300. So that's a difference of 600 kilograms, which is quite considerable for us in our practice. Having said this, you know, I do think it's kind of insane that I'm the one doing this, an artist, that big industry and government isn't doing that. I will say that. Like, I kind of don't feel like this is my job, except for the fact that I'm one of those people in society that puts my hand up and puts my work out there to say, I don't feel okay about this. And that's what I do with my life. And I'm as surprised as anyone that I'm standing here doing things to do with, you know, carbon calculators. I went to art school, and sure, I do some computer programming, but anyway, it's down to us and kids taking to the streets saying this is not okay. So I'm on board. So yeah, we put a lot of these materials under microscope and made a video artwork as well from it that's been projection mapped and as a kind of outcome during COVID. We're going to have a chat later, but of course we're on socials and everything, and you know, get in touch if you've got a question down the track, like if you're too shy to ask it or anything, just send me a message on socials or on LinkedIn or whatever, and I answer all that stuff. If you want to get a copy of the, you know, the carbon calculator or anything, totally open to that. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much for that, Betty. Just while we're transforming over for Nick, I'll introduce Nick. So Dr. Nicholas Rubines is the coordinator of the Object and Furniture Workshop and the CAM Design Workshops. He is a designer, maker and academic with a diverse research and studio practice. His projects have spanned community, non-profit, commercial and cultural institutions, and he has had work exhibited and presented nationally and internationally. His work revolves around consumption and production, material culture, technology, and the importance of retaining, promoting and applying craft skills to the almost forgotten practice of reuse and repair as a tool for slowing down waste. This research has received industry funding, grants, awards, and includes a range of national, curatorial and collaborative design projects, publications and exhibitions. He has experience working across many aspects of the manufacturing and design sectors. This includes high-scale manufacture, computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacture, that's CAD and CAM, laser technology, commercial production and fine furniture making, shop and museum fit-out, I mean, you've really been busy, exhibition design, project and design management, public art, urban design, musical instrument making and teaching at community, trade and university levels. So thank you, Nick.
Thanks, Jan. I'd like to know where you got that information from, so thanks, Jan, I appreciate that. Thanks very much for the opportunity to be here today. It's actually quite nice to see people in the one spot. As Jan said, my name's Niklavs Rubenis and I'm a Senior Lecturer in Object Design here at the School of Creative Arts and Media. So today I'm going to do a very quick overview of who I am, and I'll talk about some select work I've done, some old work and some sort of newish work, and take you on a quick journey of how my design and making practice has changed significantly and now how I've become more critical about the work that I produce. So part of this discussion is going to be about design and what it is, and how I understand it. And part of this discussion is also about repair. So a theme that continually runs through all of my work in different manifestations. But firstly, I want to establish that I'm a designer maker, and this falls under the banner of studio-based craft and design. So those generally operating in this area have a high level of skill for both designing and making, and this happens in the studio with a range of hand, machine and digital tools. So these skills are developed and honed through intensive training, experience and over many, many years. Studio-based craft and design is a similar yet distinct activity from vocations such as industrial design. So unlike industrial design, it's not tied to industry constraints. So this allows a practitioner freedom and agency. So this means an individual has the capacity to disrupt global flows of materiality through what I call micro-interventions. And in this way, the studio can be used as a laboratory. So, it's a free space. It's a space for exploration. So studio-based craft and design is also a creative enterprise that supports a community of practice, and that's an important aspect. But to kick this off, I actually want to talk about stuff, because stuff is central to this discussion that I'm about to have. So maybe I might offer some ideas up about the stuff that I'm going to talk about, and then I'll show you some stuff that I've put together with, of course, some other stuff. So I'm using that term stuff a lot. And to be very clear, I'm not using this term lightly. Stuff is a field of study. And at the crux of what I'm talking about is a world that is full and drowning in stuff. So keeping that in mind, I would like to introduce you to Fee.
This is a lady's nightgown. It belonged to my mother in the 1970s. She bought it new and wore it when I was born. I was her first of 3 children. She died nearly 12 years ago, and when my family and I were going through her personal items, we found this. This gown has a lot of memories for me, and I have a real connection to it for that reason. And I've not known what to do with it. I wore it for a little while, but my mum was a little bit more petite than I am, and so it doesn't fit particularly well. Because it's getting towards 40 years old, the fabric's quite fragile as well, and so it started to rip. As you can see, handling it more causes it to rip too, so it really doesn't have a use as an item of clothing now, but it's really special to me. And so I am really delighted about the idea of having it transformed into something else where it can have a new life.
So that was Fee, and she was talking about her forlorn vintage kimono. But let's leave Fee for a minute, and I want to go back to that world of stuff, because stuff is sort of central to this discussion, and it's central to how my practice has changed over time. Now, we now own more stuff than we have in the past. So a challenge to you, if you go home and add up all those things that you have in your home environment, it's quite staggering and surprising just how much stuff we share our lives with. So this rise in our possession, this rise in stuff, has a direct correlation with waste. And as we all know, waste is rapidly increasing. So what does that say about us and our habits? We've become so used to getting anything we want from wherever we want and at such competitive prices that our homes and workplaces bear witness every day to a transient flow of globalised material. Perhaps COVID sort of had a bit of a disruption with that. But waste isn't slowing down anytime soon. So this is a major problem for all of us, regardless of where we live. Design theorist Tony Fry makes the point that collectively we have treated the planet with such disregard, causing a slew of negative impacts and repercussions that humans may not have a future. So this quote is from over a decade ago and couldn't be any more relevant now. It's also a heavy statement, but there are 3 key words here: design, unsustainability, and disposal, and they're all linked. Design theorist Stuart Walker reiterates, waste, inequitable, unethical, unsustainable. So there's a problem here. We exist in a time with a crisis of stuff and with a crisis of waste. So the big question is, why make more stuff? This is a conundrum for all design fields, and as I mentioned before, the field that I'm associated with, of studio-based craft and design, at the heart of what it does is it makes more stuff. So this is as much about stuff as it is about design, and as stated here on the screen, design has to change as the world changes. But what is design in this context of stuff, and how does design counter a world that is clearly becoming unsustainable or is unsustainable? So there are ethical dimensions to this, and obviously an understanding of design and how it's currently approached in practice needs to be redirected in some way. So again, several of those keywords come up. So another question is, well, what alternative strategies exist for designing and making in a world full of stuff? Do we just bury our heads in the sand and continue business as usual? Do we speed this thing up and just drive it over a cliff? Do we not make anything ever again? But if we do change, what does this mean and what might this practice look like? And by we, I mean me. So designing and making has had a long history, and as I mentioned earlier right at the beginning, the field of studio-based craft and design, which I operate under, has many inherent attributes. So given this, it's suggested that there's value in cultivating historic and traditional material for design and sustainment principles. So this work here, it's quite a few years old now, but in light of what I've just discussed, this was sort of my first attempt at putting some of this thinking into practice. The work is representative of a pretty standard mode of practice for those working in my field. It's a series of 4 side tables. They were considered, they were resolved, they're technical, they're highly crafted, they're based on traditional methods. It was a commission using Australian timbers in combination with parts of a tree that was logged in a client's front yard, so there was a really strong emotional connection there. Here on the screen is 2 out of these 4 side tables. They were made in pairs so they could be passed on to the client's children as heirlooms. So now, given the identified crisis of stuff, I made these tables with longevity in mind, using joining methods that can be reversed and repaired in the future so the object can continue living. This is problematic. This makes the assumption that A, it actually can be fixed, B, that there is someone in the future who can perform that repair, and C, someone else sees value in this work. But really, at the crux of it, when the work is truly critiqued, it's just another example of a classic case of that lingering 20th century modernist ideal of form follows function. This is an old model, and it's at odds to what I discussed earlier about design needing to change and to find this new practice. So what form follows function equates to is the designer imposing their authoritative vision to give form to something in any manner they choose, through any manufacturing mechanism they choose, by manipulating any chosen material to then suit that initial desired form. There's ego tied up in this as well. Designing and making is still often tied to this way of working. So as we all currently exist in the 21st century, collectively, we are witnessing the continuing transformation of our environments and how we exist within them. The pandemic is a prime example of that. As Walker notes, our agendas have to change. It's time to move on. Professor Carol Collette in the book Radical Matter reiterates that design has been long associated as an aesthetic and functional exercise. It's time to move on. So I move on. And this leads me to a commission for the Museum of Australian Democracy in Canberra. It was a lighting installation made from 80 discarded plastic milk bottles that were salvaged from the waste stream. The work was also accompanied by amplifying an existing clock on the wall. This was an attempt at more of an experiential type of work. It's also a useful thing to look back at previous work like this as a benchmark and just to see how naive some of your thinking actually is. There were other works between the 4 side tables and this installation, but this is sort of significant in what I'm talking about, and that's where ideas start to shift around what things are and how they should look, and this starts to sort of transform. But again, what is design in this world full of stuff? So design needs to be understood as an act of cause and effect that sits within an ecology of practice. So that's a holistic view. For me, the best way of explaining this cause and effect is to compare the Latin interpretation of design, which translates to something derivative of a fact. So you could say that the definition of design is fact. And, the fact is we have a lot of stuff in the world and we have a lot of waste in the world that is born from design. So back to the installation, this is where I got my materials. So how do you get from making work like the side tables to then dumpster diving and taking things out of bins? It seems like a pretty big leap. Let's consider the plastic milk bottle briefly, which is what the lighting installation was made from. It's the contents which are of value to us, not necessarily the bottom. And the bottle is the problem. We have recycling problems and we have waste distribution problems. We just don't know how to deal with the stuff that we generate. Even with proposed advanced technologies for recycling, is recycling the answer? Recycling suggests that we can continue on our current path because there is an apparent solution to our consumption patterns. We are the problems. So this is about design and about the designing of stuff. So the milk bottle is merely just one example of thousands that flow through our homes every day. This lighting installation was not intended as a hard-edged political statement. It was an exploration of the links between design, politics and unsustainability, and the mechanism for exploring concerns and ideas that emanate from beyond just the making of another object. And the work was also about time, the time needed to change and the time needed for designers to do good work. And it always seems that we're constantly under the pump to meet deadlines and we never have enough time. So this work led on to further explorations through an exhibition titled Crafting Waste, Craft ACT in Canberra. Funnily enough, this was also supported by BMW. Thanks very much. Not only did the work lead on from dumpster diving, but also to collecting discarded things off the side of the road, to perform sort of micro interventions like this, to taking discarded objects and broken things and through transformative reuse and repair, attempting at assembling objects with new values. Lights made of tin cans, milk bottles, materials and objects with high embodied energy that we are happy to throw away. Illuminated waste. So I focused on creating a domestic space considering so much globalised stuff flows through our homes. And furniture reused and repaired for a second life. Again, these are just small micro interventions into a much, much bigger issue. So you can see that this work is an engagement in a more open collaboration with discarded materials and a further breaking down of existing notions of what objects should be or what they should look like. However, perhaps where my practice started to shift the most is here. This work is part of a series of ottomans made from bundling and lashing together discarded old and worn and torn clothes. It's a very long way from making those 4 side tables. They're not highly crafted. I love this work and they caused a few polarising opinions. So is making more stuff going to solve the issue of waste? Well, clearly not. Does the work I have shown you have any impact? No, it doesn't. But the best thing that came out of redirecting practice in this exhibition was an element of community engagement. So here's a photo from a mum who posted this via Instagram, when I still had an Instagram account, of her daughter making her own ottoman. Although this is a micro-intervention, what it highlights is critical issues and the role studio-based craft and design can play, but also how we as individuals can hack into and disrupt the flow of production and materiality. But to do this, we have to shift our thinking about what things are and how they function and what they might look like. So what I'm discussing here is a significant shift away from making to remaking. And designers have capacities for this because of being engaged with a creative process. And arguably, creativity and imagination is one of the most powerful tools we have as human beings. That's my punchline. So let's go back to Fee. Fee was in a participant called Object Therapy. This project ran from 2016 until 2019. It was a research and remaking project that aimed to encourage a rethink of our consumption patterns and to re-evaluate the objects, particularly the broken ones that surround us. Object Therapy invited members of the community to submit broken objects for repair. These broken objects were given to craftspeople, artists and designers. Now, these creatives were provided with a video of an interview from the participant, like the one that we saw of Fee at the beginning, and asked to respond to the video and broken object in any manner they chose. These designers, artists and craftspeople repaired the broken object. Once the repair had been completed, the objects of the owners were invited for a second interview and the repaired objects were unveiled. Here's Fee. This is her second interview just before her repaired object is unveiled. At the beginning, I'm reading Fee's statement from the repairers about their intent.
The properties of the textile to the wearer and vice versa. We altered the form of the fabric to be an object that would be explored visually and physically, maintaining the intimate relationship the kimono once had with the wearer. The new object was created without cutting or machine sewing, extending its value and allowing it to be returned to the form of the kimono, an object of love between mother and daughter. And they write, we were very touched by Fee's story and why she had held on to the object. So with that, this is what they've created.
Oh, wow. It's beautiful. It's really beautiful. It's okay to go and touch.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It's beautiful. It's so tactile and and squishy and soft like my mum. Oh, that's really beautiful. That's lovely. That's lovely. You know, when it sat in my cupboard for years and years, you know, it started to take on a creased shape, but that made me feel sad, like it was forlorn and unloved, and you know, reminded me of things, you know, that were lost. But now that it's got that beautiful crumpled and tactile sort of appearance and feel to it, it's it looks like it's done with love and care, and that gives me a really positive feeling rather than feeling sad about it being unloved and shoved in a cupboard. It's absolutely beautiful. That's really lovely. I want to give it a hug. I feel silly, but I'm gonna.
I'll leave Fee there. Fee's kimono was sensitively transformed into an experiential object by the fashion duo called Blimey. It's a light touch of transformation and shows how powerful design can be. What this project is about the power of design, creativity and the repair of broken objects, and how this repair can be applied to communities and ways in which people can come together. The project travelled around Australia. Here's a couple of examples actually when it was in Tasmania, in Launceston. Cecilia's coffee pot, repaired by Matt Prince. Mignon's the leek vase, made into several pieces by Peter Bowles from Glass Manifesto. And Aiden's typewriter, which was transformed into a range of different objects by Anita Deneen. So what I'll do, I've got a couple more, but I'll leave that there in the interest of time. So my work, I'll take you to my last slide. My practice is constantly changing. So what I'm trying to do is perhaps understand our human motivations more and how design can be used as an anchor for bringing people together beyond a world full of stuff. So perhaps this is about maintaining, care and repair. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
And I'll invite some discussions. I'll start off, of course, because I've got the microphone. So what comes out of this is this sort of very fine aesthetics that you were trained up into an introduction of a less formal, resolved works and into sort of a different type of aesthetics, an aesthetics of compost, one would say. And how would do you think we need to learn a new aesthetics? Is that you're taking us into the future? Or do you think we can still keep formal aesthetics? Will we start with Betty?
Yeah, great question. I just think the aesthetic of the odd has always been beautiful, and something that's organically shaped is as beautiful an aesthetic as something that's not, maybe, depending on what the thing is. So for me, I don't have to go anywhere with this. I don't have to change the way I see for myself. Art for me has always been a possibility space and a way of me being able to explore my immense curiosity. And so it's just a new aesthetic, but every work I make is a new aesthetic. So for me, there's no problem. I don't have to relearn anything. I don't think it's compost. I think, they're artefacts and they're art, and it's as much art as anything else is. And whether it's any good or not, sure, it's up for grabs. That's not my job to rank that. I just make the stuff. But hopefully don't add to the stuffness of our world. Yeah.
My response to that is I've just learnt to let go. Things are what they are. The first image that I showed was just a journal. It was part of an exhibition at the Australian Design Centre that I was invited to be part of last year. And you'll see that my son's hand keeps on coming into that. I got up early to record that, and I thought I'd have it all set up, and he got out of bed early and then came and he just kept on pestering me. And I just was like, well, it is what it is. This is the context in which I exist. Things aren't perfect. Things will never be perfect. And I'm just going to I just have to reconcile with that and resolve myself to that the aesthetic, values of things have to really change. It is what it is. Of course, there's an element of curatorship in that as well, because obviously, we're manipulating things, but also just letting go, which is a difficult thing, particularly when you're trained in a certain way of thinking when you go through art school, or if you went through art school 15, 20 years ago.
Thanks a lot. Is there any questions from the floor? Thanks, Linda.
I don't need mine, I'll just use my big voice. Oh, okay, all right. Okay, Nick, my question is to you. Like, as a dad, and I was watching you play with your lovely son the other day, do you think there's the opportunity for a generational change in terms of attitudes to materials? Because I still think of all the toys made out of plastics that we bombard kids with. And what are your thoughts on what we're actually showing to our kids?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like, my son's one of his favourite things is op shop. So we spend a lot of time in the op shop, looking for toys, matchbox cars. But it's also something that you can't control in terms of, and I'm sure everyone who has relatives that gives you things, you often can't control what other people give you. You might have a strong sense of plastic and a no plastic policy, but other people's values, or they don't necessarily value what it is that you're trying to express. So to be honest, I don't quite know how to answer your your question. Yeah, it's a tricky thing. I think all I can hope for is that, I guess, the legacy that I leave behind isn't one that's of sort of opulence, and as a parent, I guess my son can see the world for what it is.
Yeah, I think that raises a good point that you were talking to about your, at the end of your talk, where you didn't think this was your job, but perhaps it is our job to solve. So did you want to talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, well, maybe kind of piggybacking off what you were saying. I think you did answer the question, like with op shopping. Like, I think teaching people that you don't have to have everything new. Like, it's an object is an object, and we don't have to have everything. You know, it's the first time it's been, you know, unpacked and, you know, used. And the fabrics that I find, there's a lot of correlations between our practice. The fabrics I find are the ones that the op shops won't sell. So they have a whole bag that goes, you know, theoretically it gets shipped somewhere else and used as sort of rags, but a lot of the time it just goes to landfill. And so I use those fabrics in the biopolymers. And there was also, you know, just rubbish throwouts. And that's another thing with kids, like, you know, you can go on those great, ooh, what have they got out? Let's have a look. And make that exciting and interesting, and so the world is kind of a wonderland of, and the op shop's this kind of also possibility space. You don't go in there and there's your rack of size 12, 14, 16 red or whatever. You go in and go, ooh, what are we going to get? Maybe something, maybe nothing. I think that for me, that's a much more interesting world to live in, where, you know, your neighbours pop something out. I lived on a street once, now I'm going on a tangent, in St Kilda, where I live, where these new neighbours dropped in, and new neighbours arrived, invited us over for dinner, and we sat down and I said, oh, you picked up our chairs, because they were the kitchen chairs that we put out. But more than that, the other people at the table said, but you got them from us, and they were our parents' what do you do before you get married? Engagement present. And so everybody around the table had a time where these chairs had sat in their kitchen. And for me, that just it makes my soul sing, you know. So I think when kids are around that kind of thing, it's a much more interesting dinner party conversation and life experience than just coldly going into some plastic centre and buying another piece of stuff off the shelf.
But having said that too, like, I would be lying to say that I'm not a walking contradiction too, because we all consume things, you know. So, and I guess part of the point of what I'm trying to make with the work that I'm doing, or how my practice has transformed over time, is like, well, I'm trying to reconcile with that with my own practice of, you know, I could continue blindly making more things, but to what end? And I could continue blindly consuming more things, but also to what end? I guess the point is becoming just that little bit more aware about where things come from, why they're here, and where they might end up. And those external things that support us as human beings, and being a little bit more conscious of that they're finite, as human beings are.
So I wanted to just ask a question, because you're both doing work, I guess, that's mirroring your internal process and your personal evolution in these ways of thinking. And I'm wondering if you could share an experience that's been most successful in inspiring your audience or the viewer through a certain project or a certain technique, or like one of those moments where you feel like, wow, this is impacting someone else's thinking as well, which is obviously important.
That project, I was involved with object therapy. That's a good example of the bringing together of multiple communities over a single issue, which was around waste and broken objects. So it's bringing the general public in, it's bringing these participants that have broken objects, and it's bringing in, you know, repairers, you know, creative practitioners, artists, designers, craftspeople. That project it could have gone a whole lot further, but it hasn't. But a lot of that thinking is now tied up in another project I'm working on with a group of colleagues here at school. It's completely different. It's around pets and painting of pets. But that thinking is still there about how do you bring communities together and what is your role as a designer or a creative person to essentially link people together. So for me, you know, there was a couple of things. There was the crafting waste and this, you know, this mum posting this thing on Instagram, and I was like, that's awesome, you know, like someone, and kids are a great place to start that because they're a great leveler. They just see possibilities in everything. As we get older, we don't, because it gets conditioned, you know, that sort of creative nature gets drummed out of us. So for me, that was probably the starting point for that. And those ottomans, really, I came home one night, I'd had quite a few beers up the road at my neighbour's place, and I made those in about 5 minutes because I had this big stack of clothes that I'd found on the side of the road. My wife came home the next day and was like, oh, good, he's done the washing. Well, no, he hasn't. He's made some sort of weird, her words were weird, shitty bit of art. And but that sort of really triggered this thing of just completely letting go. But it was when that mum posted that thing, I was like, actually, there's something here I'd never considered that was even a possibility, and that has led on to more work, which is becoming increasingly less about me and more about my role in linking people together. So design as a tool for facilitation.
You may recall that in the slides there were these kind of big totem pole light works that were out in an environment, and we were lucky enough to do that in a national park, which felt kind of a little weird because there was a soundtrack and there was light and we were walking into, you know, an environment where there's animals and, you know, so I was aware of that as well, kind of disrupting the usual pattern of things. But what we were trying to do is build connections and empathy between people and that natural environment, and so they would appreciate it more because it was under a bit of threat. And there needed to be a bit more action, and rather than just say, yes, aren't those trees great, but we've got a few more just up the road, what's so special about this place is, you know, being able to place a lot of these qualities of these trees under microscope and show people the hidden qualities of this environment, things that they couldn't see without the use of specialist equipment. And, you know, we printed the outside of these tubes with the microscopic qualities of the environment, and this big group of young people came in who I don't think were kind of usual kind of art goers. I don't think they'd found themselves in a lot of galleries, but they bowled along in through this installation, and I was just sort of standing in the shadows, and they all just lay down on the ground and amongst the artwork and just looked up, which was like, oh, fantastic, you know. And then I just listened to their conversation. Oh, do you reckon this is like, you know, do you reckon that looks a little bit like, you know, kind of when you look at a leaf really closely, and, you know, just their conversations, and they unpicked the whole backstory of the artwork just through this very casual conversation and lying there for, I don't know, 45 minutes or something. And I feel like I changed the way they saw that environment in that moment, and maybe that can lead to them thinking that it's important that it's there.
Thank you. They're lovely responses. We've got another question over here.
Can I ask two? First one's very practical, and I feel a bit ignorant, but how do you make a biopolymer?
That's a great question, because it's like, you know, what is that thing?
Exactly, please.
Yeah, so there's lots of different ways. You need something that's going to act a bit like glue, because, the first thing is we use water.
Yes.
And then you need something that's going to act a bit like glue. And you know how, you know, you can just use flour and water and that makes glue. But you can use all these other things that are sticky as well, like gelatin is a very common one. And there's some issues with gelatin because it is used, yeah, but let's just keep it simple. And that will make, gelatin and water will make a very hard plastic-like substance. If you add a bit of glycerin in there, which can be plant, you know, from plants, you only need a tiny little bit, that will give it more flexibility. So they're the basic, very, very basic ingredients of a biopolymer, but there are lots of different ways. I use seaweeds instead of gelatin, and just to lighten the footprint of it. So I have numerous recipes, but that's the basic one.
Thank you. And then secondly, I think it was Betty actually spoke up and said, but, you know, is this my role? It's like the scientist should be doing a carbon footprint, should be looking at how to measure this. But where both of you have used art is coming from a space where you can give time to the thinking. And I think that is a really, really important thing. And I think COVID has helped us all maybe accept, maybe we can slow down, like your teenagers that lay there for 45 minutes. And I think you're doing an amazing job just helping us all see, and the bigger world see. If we take some time, you can pick this apart and, yeah, connecting community, it all comes through slowing down and looking. So I just want to say thank you, but maybe you've got a comment on how you feel you can help us make time to slow and consider where we're at.
Thank you. Nice. That's a really lovely thing to say too, so I appreciate that feedback. For me, the slowing down component is just about one idea now, and then just completely picking that apart. So not having multiple things, because, you know, repair, it's an undercurrent in all of my work. So that's just one component about how do we fix broken things. Broken things apply to all different type of areas. So it's one idea. That's all it is. It's one idea that's just become increasingly more complicated as it goes on.
Yeah, look, I think slowing down is a very personal thing. I'm not very good at being slow, so I can't say that I'm an ambassador of slow. I just feel like I've got so many ideas and I'll never have enough time to make them all, so I work. I work long hours. I didn't stop in 2020, and I hardly ever stop. I work a lot because there's a lot I want to do. So I don't know whether really I'm an ambassador of slow-centered practice. Reflective, well that's, yeah, well look, I should do a bit more of that. Yeah, apparently. Yeah, I will take your words as inspiration for what I need to do more of in my life, so thank you.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. Did anyone have any more questions? Oh, sorry.
Maybe talking about things that are broken, does it, I'm just thinking about probably the repair, and I guess you're sort of taking a different angle of what your practice once was, or when you're coming from design and fine arts, and if you're in Sydney and different areas. How does that impact on your relationships with other people in your field? And how do those interactions change with, sometimes it can be your either or you take sides with things. How, you know, I feel guilty if I'm not supporting a local maker or buying something new or spending, even so consuming, because I want to support something that might be related to what I'm doing. So I want that, you know, I'm invested in that continuing. But in that instance, I might not be thinking about, I'm sorry, I didn't get to a question. I might not be thinking about those elements or those principles at that time, but I'm thinking about it later you think you're doing the right thing in one aspect, but you might be, as you say, a bit of a walking contradiction in another. Yeah, I'm just interested in those aspects of what you do, whether how other people, or how your relationships, or how people in your career now interact with you, or whether that's a challenge. I don't know, maybe reflect on that in some aspect. I'm sorry that I'm not articulating the question very well, but I think it is.
No, thank you.
That's a really good question. I used to care a lot about what other people thought. I don't care anymore. I've learned I've just got to run my own race, and what other people do is up to them. I can only control what I can do. So, you know, I've got lots of colleagues and friends that work in the design world. They're doing their thing because of their own agendas. They've got to provide, you know, for their families. They've got to produce things for certain different motivations. I'm in a different, you know, I'm in a completely different place. So, you know, support for each other is incredibly important. But at the same token, you know, everyone comes with it at a different take. So the thing about design is that there is no right or wrong answer. You know, that's part of the problem too, but then also that's part of the value of it, is that because of us as people, we've all got completely different views on the world and how things should be. And I think that's a pretty powerful thing too.
Yeah, I think maybe the other aspect of what you were talking about is, you know, how you spend your money and where you spend your money. And I think we all have power in our pocket, a lot of power, a lot more power than we think. If we don't purchase something, when we purchase something, it will get replaced. That's how I think of the world. That gap will get filled. And so every choice that you make, you're making a call, really. And sure, I don't know the provenance of a lot of the stuff I buy because I don't have time, or I don't put the time in to find that out. I do my best. And I am really aware that, you know, if I'm buying a pair of, you know, I must have had these boots for 20 years. And if I'm buying a pair of runners, there's certain brands I won't go to with, you know, it doesn't matter. I might walk out not getting runners because they only have that brand. And so I think there's certain choices we can make with the knowledge we have. And that's what we can do. We can only work with what we've got and who we are. But I think we do have a lot of power with what we purchase or choose not to purchase. And the experiences that you have in life, you know, what you choose to spend your money on, where you go.
I have a question on
adorable.
Policy design. And I saw that you had the War on Waste guy, and that's quite a political show. And, you know, just your opinions on what policies there are and how maybe you could influence policy, even at a local level, like maybe say through some kind of design intervention with citizens at the tip shop, a repair cafe or something like this, just sort of on that. You mentioned politics, so I'm really interested in that sort of citizen involvement and policy making.
Yeah, well, I suppose there's the whole movement around the right to repair, you know, like, and that's a policy component, and holding, you know, companies responsible for the objects and the things that they put out into the world as well, that there is that holistic view of where things end up, and giving people the right to repair the objects that they own, and that's part of the problem too. You know, lots of stuff is designed purely to last a certain amount of time, or we can't fix it for whatever reason because of the way in which it's been designed. I think that's a good question, because the repair conversation is still pretty much at a grassroots level. But it has to come from both. It has to come from top level, come down, and it has to come from bottom level up. There's not enough that's coming from top. So, and I don't really know how to address that, to be honest. You know, it takes groups of people to address those issues. You know, it's not just one singular person to set it up.
We did a talk here at the end of last year, and Marty Welch, one of the photographer, the head of photography, does a lot of work in the Antarctic, and he made the comment, it was a photo of him, and it stuck with me ever since he said it, of him, of this image, a white background, him walking across, across this big, vast expanse of kind of nothingness. And his point was, we can't do this alone. And it's always stuck with me that things like this requires groups of people. That's why I'm interested in how communities are built, to sort of start to rally. Because like Betty said, we do as citizens have power, but we've only got power when there's groups of us together that can exercise that. I don't have an answer. I don't know.
I agree, it's very much part of our role. Betty, do you have a reply?
Yeah, NAVA, the National Association of Visual Arts, is making great policy inroads at the moment. If you want to get involved with NAVA. They're making real change. They're going to government, like literally to Canberra. They literally talk to politicians. And I'm saying that because, you can wave as many flags as you want and they might see it on television, but they're having meetings. And they're getting in front of them and putting the arts in front of it as being an important thing. And as well as, there's environmental factors in that, but they're not an environmental agency. They're, they're our National Association of Visual Arts. So I agree, although I think we can personally make a difference with our spending. I don't think that has to be a group thing, picking stuff up off the street and going to op shops.
But again, I guess it comes down to, the capacity to be able to make things as well. Like we've shifted so much from a predominantly manual labour force to now to a sedentary one. So we've lost the connection with our hands. And also, like I mentioned before in the talk, we can get anything we want from wherever in the world. Just click a button. And we don't need to worry about even trying to fix that thing. It breaks, we throw it out, we can replace it quite easily. So that capacity to actually, those kinesthetic skills, and there's, heaps of stuff around how it's connected to the development of the brain. We know that. We've known that for a long time.
You could probably have to solve a lot of mental health problems that are increasing, and there's probably connections there too.
Yeah, well, the research is there to support, how awesome the arts is in so many facets of society. And that's why I mentioned NAVA, because they really are putting the arts forward as a highly organised, incredibly profitable thing for society. And they're putting it, in front of federal politicians. And yeah, get involved with that, because it takes... I'm primarily an artist, I'm not an activist, I'm not a politician. I can make some beautiful stuff and get eyeballs on it. So I've worked with organisations in the Amazon who are trying to raise awareness around, the next season of burning, for example, because I was there in 2019 when it was on fire. I was in the Amazon whilst it was on fire. And so for the next season, they were trying to, they ran a whole campaign, particularly Brazilian-based, because many people there don't know what's going on. So I can lend my skills to things I believe passionately in. It's not my own work, but I'm an artist. So yeah, I'm not an activist I run workshops though, so tomorrow whoever's coming will learn how they can make stuff themselves in a very simple way with, a pot and some water and a stove and their hands. And, you can make so much stuff with this, You could make a home out of biopolymer, I'm serious. You could make all your bowls and everything. It's such a great substance.
Okay, I'm afraid I'm going to have to close down now. It's 2 o'clock. So thank you. I'm really happy that it's provoked some questioning and thinking. There were a few other hands still to go, but I think we now need to close up. So once again, thank you very much to
Thanks,
Nick and Betty.